The year was 1884, and for Esther Hale, time had clotted like old blood. 2 winters had passed since the fever had stolen her husband, Henry, and then their daughter, little Clara, leaving Esther in a silence so profound it had its own weight. She lived on a small homestead at the frayed edge of Redemption Creek, a town whose name was a cruel joke. There was no redemption here, only judgment, hard as the packed earth of its single street. The land itself was a study in severity, a vast, wind-scoured canvas of brown and grey that offered little comfort and demanded constant toil. Esther's life had shrunk to the size of her loss. Her days were a metronome of chores, a rhythm of survival that kept the deeper currents of grief from dragging her under. She woke before the sun, its first pale light finding her already in the dirt of her garden, coaxing stubborn life from the unforgiving soil. She mended, she cleaned, she preserved. Each task was a bulwark against memory, a way to fill the hollow spaces Clara's laughter and Henry's quiet strength had once occupied. The townsfolk saw her as a phantom, a woman wrapped in perpetual mourning, and they left her to it. Their pity was a blade she did not wish to feel, and their piety a suffocating blanket. So she kept to the margins, a solitary figure moving through a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Her isolation was a fortress she had built brick by silent brick. Inside its walls, she was safe from the whispers and the pitying glances, safe from the casual cruelty that Redemption Creek reserved for anyone who did not fit its rigid mold. This cruelty was most often directed at the Cheyenne, whose ancestral lands the town had been carved out of. They were specters from a past the settlers wanted to forget, their presence on the outskirts of town a constant, unwelcome reminder. They were called savages, thieves, heathen swords, spat like tobacco juice, staining the air with contempt. Esther heard the talk on her rare trips into town for salt and flour, and she simply lowered her head, making herself smaller, wanting only to finish her business and retreat back to the quiet ache of her solitude. Her grief was a world unto itself, leaving no room for the injustices of the one outside. It was a trip for kerosene and thread that shattered the fragile peace of her existence. The sun was high and merciless, beating down on the dusty street. A commotion had gathered outside the mercantile, a tight knot of self-righteous anger. At its center stood Arthur Vance, the town's blacksmith and self-appointed arbiter of justice, his face flushed with power. Before him, held firm by 2 grim-faced men, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 15, a slip of a thing with wide, terrified eyes and the proud, sharp features of the Cheyenne. "Stole a whole sack of flour," a woman shrieked, her voice thin and sharp, "right from my wagon." The girl, whose name Esther would later learn was Mesa, said nothing. Her silence was not an admission of guilt, but a wall of dignity against their hate. She stared straight ahead, her small frame trembling almost imperceptibly. "We have laws against thievery in this town," Vance boomed, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. He enjoyed these moments, the rapt attention of his neighbors, the fear in the eyes of his victim. "And we make examples of thieves, 10 lashes, let it be a lesson to her kind." A collective gasp, part horror, part grim satisfaction, rippled through the crowd. 10 lashes could break a grown man. For a child this slight, it was an act of unspeakable brutality. Esther felt a cold sickness wash over her. She saw the raw terror that finally broke through the girl's composure, her eyes darting around, searching for a friendly face and finding none. In that terrified gaze, Esther saw a specter of her own Clara, lost and alone. Something inside her, a chord of maternal instinct she thought long dead, pulled taut. The numbness that had been her shield for 2 years cracked, and a hot, fierce rage poured into the fissures. Before she understood what she was doing, her feet were moving, carrying her through the parting crowd until she stood before Arthur Vance. The town went silent, mouths agape at the sight of the reclusive widow stepping into the center of their drama. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice rusty from disuse but surprisingly steady. He turned, his eyes narrowing. "Mistress Hale, this is no concern of yours." "The girl," Esther said, her gaze fixed on him, ignoring the burning stares of the townspeople. "She is just a child. Whatever she did, this is not justice, it is cruelty." Vance let out a short, humorless laugh. "It's the law, Mistress Hale, the law she broke." Esther's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She looked past him to Mesa, whose dark eyes were now fixed on her, filled with a desperate, burgeoning hope that was almost painful to witness. The decision was not made with thought, but with a visceral certainty that rose from the deepest part of her soul. It was an act of defiance against the death that had taken everything from her, a sudden, fierce need to protect the life that stood shivering in front of her now. "Then let me," Esther said, the words falling into the stunned silence. "Let me take the punishment for her." A wave of disbelief rolled through the crowd. Arthur Vance stared at her as if she'd sprouted a second head. "What did you say?" "You heard me," Esther insisted, her voice gaining strength. "She is a child. I am a grown woman. If a debt must be paid with a whip, let it be paid from my back, 10 lashes. I will take them in her place." Vance's face was a mask of confusion, which quickly curdled into a sneer. He saw a chance to assert his dominance in a new, more interesting way. To whip a Cheyenne girl was one thing. To publicly humiliate the widow of a respected man like Henry Hale was another level of power. He could break her strange pride and reinforce his own standing in one go. "Very well, Mistress Hale," he said, a cruel light dancing in his eyes. "A debt is a debt. Tie her to the post." Two men, hesitant at first, moved to obey. Esther did not flinch. She walked to the hitching post in the center of the square, her movements deliberate. She untied the bonnet from her head, letting it fall to the dust. As they pulled her arms forward, she turned her head and met Mesa's gaze. The girl was frozen, her face a portrait of horror and disbelief. Esther gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent command to be strong. Then she closed her eyes and braced herself, focusing on the memory of Clara's hand in hers. The first lash was a line of pure fire drawn across her back, stealing the air from her lungs. A collective gasp went through the crowd. She bit down hard on her lip, tasting blood, but refused to cry out. The second followed, then the third, each one a fresh wave of agony. The world narrowed to the rough wood of the post beneath her hands and the searing pain that consumed her. She counted them in her head, each number a small victory against the darkness that threatened to swamp her senses. At 10, it stopped. For a moment, she sagged against the post, every muscle screaming. The world swam back into focus, hazy and distant. They released her. She stumbled, but forced her legs to hold. Without looking at anyone, her back a tapestry of raw, bleeding welts, she retrieved her bonnet from the dust. She could feel every eye in Redemption Creek on her, a mixture of shock, disgust, and a sliver of grudging awe. She did not care. She pushed through the silent crowd and began the long, painful walk back to her homestead, leaving the town, the girl, and the reasons why behind her. She thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. The following day dawned in a haze of pain. Esther had spent a fitful night, her back on fire. She had managed to clean the wounds as best she could with salt water and apply a poultice of yarrow, but the simple act of breathing was an exercise in agony. She moved through her morning chores with slow, deliberate care, her body a stranger to her. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the yard, she saw them. 5 figures on horseback, cresting the low ridge that marked the edge of her property. They were Cheyenne, their silhouettes unmistakable against the pale morning sky. A knot of pure fear tightened in her stomach. They had come for her. Perhaps they thought she was responsible for what happened to the girl, or perhaps they were here for some other, more violent reason. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her bruised ribs. She had no weapon save for a small hatchet by the hearth. It would be useless. They rode not with aggression, but with a slow, solemn purpose. They dismounted at her fence line, a clear sign of respect, and approached the cabin on foot. Esther stood frozen in her doorway, watching them come. They were all tall, powerfully built men, their faces stern and unreadable. The one in the lead, who looked to be the eldest, had a long scar that cut across his left eyebrow. She expected a confrontation, a demand. Instead, what happened next defied all her expectations. When they were a few paces from her porch, the 5 men stopped. Then, as one, they lowered themselves to their knees in the dusty yard. They bowed their heads, their long black hair catching the morning light. The eldest one looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. They held no malice, only a profound, unsettling gravity. "We are the brothers of Mesa," he said. His English was clipped and heavily accented, but clear. He gestured to himself and then to the others. "I am Vokin. These are my brothers. Moketavato, Honyahaka, Wavoka, Chayton." Esther could only stare, bewildered. Her mind struggled to make sense of the scene. 5 Cheyenne warriors were kneeling in her yard. Vokin continued, his voice low and resonant. "Our sister told us what you did. You took the whip that was meant for her. You took her shame and her pain onto your own body. Our people do not have a word for such an act from one of yours. It is a debt that can never be repaid." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her pale face and the stiff way she held herself. He saw the pain she was in. "But it must be honored. You have no man, no sons to protect you. From this day until the last of our days, we will be your protectors. Your fight is our fight. Your enemies are our enemies. We pledge our lives to you, woman who took the whip." The words hung in the still air, heavy and unbelievable. Esther felt a wave of dizziness. This was not what she wanted. She had acted on a single, desperate impulse, and now it had brought this complication, this immense, terrifying honor, to her doorstep. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You don't have to do this. I don't want. I just want to be left alone." Vokin's expression did not change. "It is not a choice. It is a matter of honor. We have sworn it." He rose to his feet, followed by his brothers. They did not move any closer. "We will make our camp by the creek. We will not disturb you, but we will be here. You are not alone anymore." Without another word, they turned and walked back to their horses. Esther watched them go, a storm of fear, confusion, and a strange, unwelcome flicker of something else, something that felt perilously like relief ridging inside her. She had sought only solitude, and in one selfless act had found herself bound to 5 men whose world was entirely alien to her own. The walls of her fortress had not just been breached, they had been razed to the ground. The brothers were true to their word. They established a small, discreet camp in the cottonwood grove by the creek that bordered her land, far enough away to grant her privacy, but close enough for their presence to be a constant, silent fact. Esther's first few days were spent in a state of high anxiety. She watched them from her window, a knot of apprehension in her chest. She saw them moving about their camp, their efficiency and quietness unnerving. They were ghosts at the edge of her vision, a promise of either protection or ruin. She did not yet know which. Her initial resistance was stubborn. She tried to ignore them, to go about her routine as if they were not there, but their presence began to subtly reshape her world. One morning, she found a freshly dressed rabbit on her porch, left sometime in the pre-dawn darkness. She hesitated, her pride warring with her pragmatism. Her own snares had been empty for a week. With a sigh of resignation, she took the offering inside. The next day, it was 2 plump prairie hens. The following week, she woke to the rhythmic sound of an axe. Peeking out, she saw the one called Moketavato, a man built like a small mountain, methodically splitting logs from a fallen oak at the edge of her property. By midday, a neat, towering stack of firewood stood beside her cabin, more than she could have chopped in a month. He did it without a word, and was gone before she could even think of what to say. A silent exchange began to form between the lonely cabin and the quiet camp. It was a language spoken in deeds, not words. After a few days of their gifts of game, Esther found herself stewing more than she needed for one person. With her heart hammering, she left the iron pot on a flat stone halfway between her porch and their camp, a plume of steam rising into the cool evening air. She scurried back inside, feeling foolish, and did not dare to look. The next morning, the pot was back in the same spot, scrubbed clean. Slowly, painstakingly, the fear began to recede, replaced by a reluctant curiosity. She learned to distinguish them not just by name, but by their manner. Vokine was the leader, his authority unquestioned. He was the one who would sometimes nod to her from a distance, a solemn acknowledgement. Moketavato was the quiet giant, a man of immense strength who moved with surprising gentleness. Honyahaka was younger, with a fire in his eyes she recognized as a kind of contained wildness, yet he was the one she often saw practicing with a bow, his focus absolute. The other two, Wovoka and Cheyenne, were watchful sentinels, often disappearing for hours only to return with news from the wider world, conveyed to their brothers in the low, flowing cadences of their own tongue. One afternoon, a visitor came. It was Mesa. The girl approached the cabin hesitantly, clutching a small deerskin bundle. Esther's breath caught in her throat. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Mesa stopped a few feet away, her eyes cast down. "I brought you something," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She held out the bundle. "For your back." Esther took it. Inside were dried herbs and a small pot of dark, fragrant salve. She recognized willow bark and comfrey. "Thank you," Esther said, her voice thick with emotion. Mesa finally looked up, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. "No one has ever done a thing like that for me, for any of my people." "You are just a child," Esther said softly. "You reminded me of my own daughter." The words were out before she could stop them, a crack in the dam of her grief. An understanding passed between them, a bond forged in pain and defiance. Mesa began to visit regularly. She would help Esther in the garden, her small, nimble fingers weeding and tending the plants. She was quiet, but her presence was a balm. In turn, Esther started teaching her English words, pointing to objects and sounding them out. Shovel, water, sun. Mesa, in return, taught her the Cheyenne names for the plants and the birds. Sotayo, Vivina. It was a fragile bridge being built between two worlds. Through Mesa, the brothers also became less intimidating. Esther learned that their father had been a great war chief, killed years ago in a skirmish with soldiers. Their mother had died of a wasting sickness the previous winter, leaving Vokin to lead their small family. They were proud, displaced, and fiercely loyal. The pledge they had made to her was not a whim, it was the bedrock of their code. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, the wind howling like a thing grieving, a section of her stable roof, weakened by rot, tore loose with a splintering crack. Before she could even process what had happened, the 5 brothers were there, emerging from the twilight like spirits of the storm. In the driving rain, lit by flashes of lightning, they worked. Vokin directed, his voice sharp and clear above the wind. Moketavato and Honyahaka hauled new timbers, while Wovoka and Cheyenne secured a canvas tarp over the gaping hole. Esther brought them her lantern and stood by, holding it aloft, the wind whipping her hair and dress. For the first time, they were not separate entities, the woman in the cabin, the men in the camp, but a single unit fighting against the chaos of the storm. When the worst of it was over and the roof was secured, they stood soaked and shivering in the lee of the stable. Esther looked at their faces, streaked with rain and dirt. "Come inside," she said, the invitation leaving her lips before she had time to question it. "Come inside and get warm." Vokin hesitated for only a moment before giving a curt nod. One by one, they filed into her small, warm cabin. It was the first time they had crossed her threshold. The space seemed to shrink around their large frames. They stood awkwardly near the hearth while Esther stoked the fire and put a kettle on to boil. The silence was thick, but it was no longer the silence of suspicion. It was the silence of men who did not know the customs of this house, and of a woman who was slowly, terrifyingly, learning to let the world back in. That night, a foundation of trust, laid stone by silent stone, finally began to set. The arrangement, however quiet, could not go unnoticed for long. Redemption Creek was a town that fed on gossip and fear, and the sight of 5 Cheyenne warriors living on the widow Hale's land was a feast. The initial shock at Esther's public defiance had curdled into suspicion, and then into outright hostility. Whispers slithered through the town like snakes in tall grass. She was a traitor, they said. She was keeping a harem of savages. She had bewitched them. The story of her taking the lashes was twisted from an act of strange compassion into proof of her madness, or worse, her treachery against her own kind. Arthur Vance, his pride still smarting from the public challenge to his authority, fanned the flames of this paranoia. He spoke of the danger, of the threat these men posed to the good, God-fearing folk of the town. He painted Esther not as a grieving widow, but as a dangerous apostate who had turned her back on her own people. His words found fertile ground in the hearts of men who already saw the Cheyenne as a menace to be eradicated. Esther felt the change whenever she was forced to go to the mercantile. The silence that fell as she entered was no longer one of pity, but of cold, hard judgment. Faces turned away. The storekeeper, Mr. Callahan, served her with clipped, barely civil words, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Children who once might have offered a shy hello now scurried away as if she carried a plague. She was an outcast, branded by an act of kindness. The fortress of her grief had been replaced by a new kind of isolation, one imposed not by her own choice, but by the hatred of her neighbors. One afternoon, Vokin appeared at her door. It was unusual for him to approach so directly in the daylight. His face was like a stone carving. "Men from the town," he said, his voice low. "They watch from the ridge. They have rifles." A cold dread washed over Esther. She went to the window and saw them, 2 men partially hidden by the scrub brush on the ridge overlooking her property. They were too far to be identified, but their intent was clear. They were spies, sentries for the town's animosity. "They are afraid," Vokin stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "They are hateful," Esther corrected, her voice tight, "and a hateful man with a rifle is more dangerous than a frightened one." The pressure mounted over the next week. The surveillance was constant. The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The peace Esther had begun to find in her strange new life was shattered. Now she felt a different kind of fear, not just for herself, but for the men who had pledged themselves to her. She saw the tension in them, too. Honyahaka's hand rarely strayed from the knife at his belt. Mokotavato's quietness seemed to deepen, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. They were warriors, and they were being provoked. The inevitable escalation came on a Sunday, just after the church bells had rung out their hollow call to worship. A posse of 12 men, led by Arthur Vance on his big black gelding, rode out from town. They did not stop at the fence line. They rode straight into her yard, their horses tearing up the soft earth of her garden, trampling the rows of beans and squash that she and Mesa had so carefully tended. Esther rushed out onto the porch, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Mesa, who had been helping her shell peas, scurried behind her, her eyes wide with terror. From the cottonwood grove, the 5 brothers emerged, melting out of the trees like vengeful spirits. They did not run, they walked, fanning out in a loose, formidable line between the cabin and the posse. They held bows and war lances, and their faces were masks of deadly resolve. The yard became a tinderbox, filled with the silence of imminent violence. "Esther Hale," Vance bellowed, his face a blotchy red of rage and exertion. "We've come to put an end to this abomination." He gestured with his rifle toward the brothers. "You will send these savages packing. Then you will come with us back to town to account for your behavior." The good people of Redemption Creek will not tolerate a traitor in their midst. Esther's entire body trembled, but it was with a fury she had never known. Everything she had lost, everything she had suffered, and the small, fragile new life she had found, coalesced into a single point of unbending resolve. She had allowed the town's judgment to rule her for too long. She had hidden in the shadows of her grief. No more. She looked at Vance, at the faces of the men behind him she had known for years, men who had offered condolences at her husband's funeral. She saw their weakness, their fear masquerading as strength. Then she looked back at the 5 stoic figures standing ready to die for her. She knew where she stood. "This is my land, Arthur Vance," she said, her voice ringing out with a clarity that surprised them all. "And these men are my guests. They are under my protection." A ripple of incredulous laughter went through the posse. "Your protection?" Vance sneered. "You are a foolish, hysterical woman. Stand aside before you get hurt." He raised his rifle slightly, a clear threat. In response, Honyahaka drew an arrow and knocked it to his bowstring in one fluid, deadly motion. The tension in the yard stretched to a breaking point. A single shout, a single shot, would unleash a massacre. It was then that Esther did the last thing any of them expected. She walked down the steps of her porch, her back straight, her head held high. She walked past the line of her protectors and stopped directly in front of Vance's horse, forcing the great animal to shift and sidle nervously. She stood so close she could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. "You speak of abominations," she said, her voice low now but carrying a terrible weight. "I will tell you what an abomination is. It is a town that calls itself Redemption while its men prepare to whip a child for a handful of flour. It is a man who calls himself a leader while he preys on the weak and frightens his neighbors with lies." She turned her gaze on the other men, her eyes sweeping over them, pinning each one in turn. "I see you, Thomas Callahan. You sold my husband his last suit of clothes. And you, Mr. Donovan. Henry helped you raise your barn. Did you think my courage died with him? Did you think my heart was buried in the ground?" Her voice rose again, filled with the fire of righteous fury. "These 5 men," she declared, gesturing back toward the brothers, who watched her with stunned reverence, "have shown me more decency, more honor, and more Christian charity than this entire town put together. They have protected me. They have provided for me. They have treated me with respect. You have offered me nothing but scorn and suspicion. Now you come to my home with rifles to drive them out and drag me away. For what crime? The crime of accepting kindness, the crime of refusing to hate?" She stepped back and stood before the brothers, turning to face the posse as if to shield them with her own body. "You will not touch them. You will not set 1 foot further onto this property. If you want them, you will have to come through me." A profound and shocked silence descended upon the yard. Her words had struck home, shaming them with a truth they could not deny. They had come to confront a madwoman consorting with savages. They found themselves facing the resolute widow of their friend, a woman armed not with a weapon but with an unassailable moral authority. Mr. Donovan lowered his rifle, his gaze falling to the ground. Another man shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. The unity of the posse was broken. Vance saw his support crumbling, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury. "This isn't over, you witch," he snarled, his voice a venomous hiss. He yanked hard on his horse's reins, spinning the animal around. "You've made your choice. You'll rot out here with them." He spurred his horse and galloped away, his posse trailing behind him, a disorganized and shame-faced retreat. They left behind a trampled garden and a silence that felt sacred. In the quiet aftermath, Esther stood trembling, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her weak-kneed. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Vokin. His face, usually so stern, was filled with an emotion she could not name. It was awe, respect, something deeper. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to gesture to the very air around her. "The spirit of a great chief lives in you," he said, his voice soft with reverence. "Our pledge was a matter of honor, Now, it is a matter of the heart. You are our family. This place, he swept his hand to encompass the cabin, the creek, the wounded garden, is our home. Esther looked from his face to his brothers, who were now gathered near. She saw his sentiment reflected in each of their eyes. In the eyes of Mokotavato, a quiet promise of unwavering strength. In Honyahaka's, the fiery spirit now banked in service to her. In the gazes of Wovoka and Cheyenne, a steadfast loyalty. And behind them, Mesa was beaming, her face a sun breaking through clouds. A sob caught in Esther's throat, but it was not one of grief. It was a release of 2 years of frozen sorrow, a thawing of the ice that had encased her heart. The tears that fell were not bitter but cleansing. She was no longer Esther Hale, the tragic widow of Redemption Creek. She had been remade in the crucible of defiance and acceptance. Life on the homestead settled into a new rhythm, a new equilibrium. The invisible line between the cabin and the camp dissolved. The brothers no longer left gifts on her porch, they brought them to her door. They shared their meals together, their different languages weaving together around the warmth of the fire. The silence that had once defined Esther's existence was now filled with the low murmur of conversation, with the sounds of shared work, and sometimes with Mesa's bright, clear laughter. Esther taught Mesa to read and write, and in turn, Mesa and her brothers taught Esther the deeper language of the land, how to read the clouds, how to find water, which roots healed and which nourished. Her garden, replanted and tended by many hands, thrived as it never had before. The homestead was no longer just a place of survival. It was a sanctuary, a small, defiant island of an unconventional family in a hostile world. She found she had not forgotten how to laugh. The sound, when it first came, was a surprise to her own ears, bubbling up in response to one of Honyahaka's rare, dry jokes. It felt like a ghost limb returning, a phantom sensation that was suddenly, miraculously real. The brothers had stopped and looked at her, their faces breaking into slow, rare smiles. In that moment, she knew she was healed. The grief for Henry and Clara would always be a part of her, a quiet room in the house of her heart, but it was no longer the whole house. New rooms had been built, filled with new light and new life. The town of Redemption Creek left them alone, watching from a distance with a mixture of fear and resentment, but Esther no longer cared what they thought. Her world was no longer defined by their judgment, but by the loyal faces around her table. She had taken 10 lashes meant for a stranger, and in return, she had been given a family. She had found her redemption, not in the church or the town that bore the name, but in the fierce, protective love of 5 Cheyenne brothers and their sister, right there in the dust and sunlight of her own backyard.